Now we come to the most important part. None of that will matter. All of these preparation gauges and measurements and comparing measurements to measurements and adjusting measurements to the measurements compared to measurements. All of that will not matter if you cast on stitches and just start knitting without checking up your work. So the most important part here is measure your work as you knit. And this is the most important part, because we can do all sorts of swatches and measure the gauge as much as we want, multiply the stitches and whatnot. But if we don't check the work as we knit, we might end up with a sweater that doesn't fit well. So what I mean by that, measure your work as you knit. Of course, measuring lengths, that's very easy, right? So once in a while, stop, measure, don't measure the stitches on the needle, measure from underneath the needle. If the fiber is heavy, like bamboo, for example, then measure it as it's hanging, so the fiber gets kind of that droopiness from the gravity. But the first measurement that you should make is the width, because remember we talked about how the gauge in the swatch is not usually the gauge that we get in the sweater for various reasons, right? The biggest of them is that we are human. Remember that? So that's a thing. It's happening really. And what we can do to kind of not prevent it, but at least to be aware of it, is once you work 2 or 3 inches, 4 inches, like 10 centimeters of, like, you cast on stitches for the back of the sweater, or you're working around. So once you work a short piece of your sweater, stop. Move the stitches onto the cable of the cable needle, or move it to spare yarn. It's still worth it. It's extra time, but it's worth it. And measure it. For best results, even block it and then measure the width. See? And see how the width is compared to the measurement that you want to get. It won't be exactly the same. In the majority of cases, be prepared that the measurement will not be exactly the same for various reasons, like elasticity of the fabric and the changes in gauge and stuff like that. So, but now you would be in power to decide whether it's okay with you, right? So let's say you measured this, your back, the beginning of the back of your sweater, and you see that it is like half an inch wider than you want. And you would think, you know what, not a big deal. First of all, as it starts, you start wearing it, it will slide down a little bit, so it will become narrower, right? The gravity works. But at least you would know what to expect, and you would be kind of prepared that, okay, this sweater might be a little bit too wide, but I'm fine with that. If the measurement is off by much and you don't want to keep it that way, then what you do, you measure your gauge again from that piece of fabric to get that gauge, that is probably your real gauge. So to get that gauge, and then you unravel that piece and go back to the planning stage when we were matching the gauge and all these steps, right? But at least you didn't do it when the sweater was finished. So yes, you had to unravel a little bit of work, but it's nothing compared to the the disappointment of an ill-fitting sweater, and it's nothing compared to the fact that you would need to re-knit sweater, adjust the width, somehow cut it out, do something about it. So it's a small sacrifice. So I really highly recommend to measure your work as you knit. So you start by measuring the width first, and then if the width is okay, then you keep going, measure the length once in a while, and then if you notice that down the road something, you got a new idea or something, it's okay to make adjustments. You might want to make the the armhole a little bit longer or shorter, you know, so it's fine too. But make notes in the pattern and be mindful of what's happening on your needles. Don't be just following instructions without kind of comparing those instructions to the result you want to get. And again, nothing wrong with the pattern instructions, but it's not a set of rules set in stone, you know, it's just a guideline. So we use patterns as a base to make something, remember, that fits our perfect, unique body. And we have to be in charge every step of the process, from the very beginning, from the planning the texture and the finding the gauge, to planning the construction, and eventually finding the measurements that we need, and then following through with those measurements by measuring the work as we knit.